Good morning and welcome. I'm Peter Beinart, a non-resident fellow with the Foundation for Middle East Peace and editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and I write the Beinart Notebook at Substack. I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinar today, co-sponsored with Jewish Currents, Til Kingdom Come, Evangelicals, Israel, Palestine, and Messianic Politics. A new film, Til Kingdom Come, takes a close look at the phenomenon of Christian Zionism and American evangelicalism and how they relate to Israel-Palestine. As the film synopsis says, millions of American evangelicals are praying for the state of Israel. They donate sacrificially to Israel's foremost philanthropic organization, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, because they fervently believe the Jews are crucial to Jesus' return. With unparalleled access, this film exposes a stunning backstory of the Trump and Netanyahu administrations, where financial, political, and messianic motivations intersect with the apocalyptic worldview that is insistently reshaping American foreign policy towards Israel and the Middle East. Our panelists, and you can read their full bios on our website, are Maya Zinshtein, who is an Emmy Award-winning Israeli documentary filmmaker and journalist. Among numerous prestigious awards, Zinshtein was named Best Director at the 2016 Jerusalem Film Festival for her acclaimed documentary Forever Pure, which later went on to win an Emmy Award for Outstanding Politics and Government Documentary in 2018. Sarah Posner, who is a reporting fellow with Type Investigations, her new book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship the Altar of Donald Trump, was published in May 2020. And Lara Friedman, who is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, a contributing writer at Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Middle East Project. Before we get started with the questions, a little housekeeping. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion between the panelists and me, ending at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Greetings to all those joining us on Facebook. In addition to my own questions, I'm eager to take audience questions. Please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can do so at any time throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and will do my best to weave as many of your questions as possible into the discussion. Also, please keep an eye on the chat box. My colleagues at FMEP will be putting useful links and information in that box throughout the discussion. Don't use the chat box for questions. I won't see them. And finally, please note that we have enabled the closed captioning function for those who prefer or need to read rather than hear the discussion. Now let's begin. Maya. First, can you give a very brief synopsis of the film for those who haven't seen it yet, maybe mentioning Yael and the Binghams? The film is amazing. The kind of access you got, including on the Hill and inside evangelical institutions like Jim Hagee's Christians United for Israel, is incredible. With the benefit of all of that access and the relationship you built, how would you characterize the relationship between American evangelical Christians and Israel's settlement movement?
Thank you, Peter, and I want to thank for hosting us here. It's great to be here from my living room in Tel Aviv. Til Kingdom Come is basically tries to explore the bond between the Christian evangelical community, mostly in the United States, and the state of Israel, and it follows two main characters. Boyd Bingham, that he's a pastor in a small church in Middlesbrough, Kentucky. It's one of the poorest places in the United States. And this small church is basically one of the biggest donors of the Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which is the biggest philanthropic organization here in Israel. So this is basically the basis of this film, is following these two young, Boyd and Yael, both of them taking the legacy of their fathers and taking it forward. But the overall was, of course, the 4 years of the Trump administration, and how the Christian evangelical community backed this administration and basically pushed it towards certain moves here in the Middle East. Of course, the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the deal of the century, and cutting the aid to the American aid to the Palestinians. So the film both works on two levels, on the ground, let's say, the grassroots of this bond between Christian evangelicals, and goes to the top, to the White House and to Jerusalem. For your second question, I think you know, I think this relationship definitely came for a certain peak in the last 4 years. They exist for at least 40 years. They've been established at the beginning of the 80s with Reagan and Menachem Begin. That was kind of the opening, even though Billy Graham visited here and Matt Goldemeyer even before. But I think the last 4 years definitely, and Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump, two secular leaders, brought this influence of these very religious groups, really gave them the space to influence their policy. And the film explores that, and I think it mostly shows how deeply this influence on the ground.
That's great. Thank you. Sarah, you've been researching and writing on American evangelical Christians for years. Based on your work, how do you see the evolution of Israel as a focal point in American evangelical Christian politics? And how do you see the issue evolving in the future? For example, did Trump raise the bar for future Republican presidents who need the evangelical vote to win? And how do you see this continuing to shape the U.S. debate around issues related to Israel, including Iran?
Well, obviously, every Republican president since Reagan has relied on the white evangelical vote, which in turn is very focused on supporting Israel, which in their mind is supporting the settlements and the occupation. That's their geopolitical stance. Their theological stance is, of course, that Israel is the locus of where Jesus will return. I think Trump did raise the bar because he gave them access and gave access to previously fringe players on the Christian right. He sort of expanded the universe of people who were welcome at the White House or welcome at events and so forth. So he raised the bar in that way. And he also raised the bar with his brazenness on Israel and on related issues like Iran, backing out of the Iran deal, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, giving the Israeli government more of a carte blanche on settlements and so forth. So I do think he raised the bar for the Christian right, for white evangelicals, and looking down the road, I would predict seeing potential candidates like Mike Pompeo or Ted Cruz trying to reach that bar or maybe go beyond it.
Great. Laura, for the past 2 decades, you've been watching and documenting the phenomenon of growing evangelical Christian engagement and influence with respect to Israel-related policies. In your assessment, how significant is the role of evangelical Christians on Capitol Hill when it comes to Israel-related policies, settlements, Iran, et cetera? And as this role has grown more significant, how has it altered traditional political dynamics related to Israel in the United States?
Thanks, Peter. And I speak about this with a lot of humility on this panel because Sarah is the guru when it comes to these issues. And what Maya learned over the course of that film, I think it dwarfs what most of us have learned in our lives on this. I will say, as someone who has been working with Capitol Hill on Israel-Palestine for the past 20 years or so, there has been a clear evolution of the role of evangelicals on this. So as Maya said, this has always been an issue for evangelicals. As Sarah said, this has evolved in terms of how it's treated within the evangelical community. On the Hill, if you were to go back 20 years, there were evangelical Christians who cared about Israel and who were active. I mean, going back to the 90s when I lived in Jerusalem, we had then groups of evangelicals who would come out and visit the settlers and support the settlements. And I remember Palestinian friends of mine in the early days of the peace process saying, hey, they don't even seem to care about us. What's wrong? But on the Hill, you saw them really start to come into their own with the emergence of Christians United for Israel. I remember vividly in the early aughts, the first time you had someone like Joe Lieberman as a keynote speaker at Christians United for Israel, giving this Jewish and in some ways democratic kosher stamp to what was going on there, and almost moving them into what was really more the mainstream discourse on this. You then had the rise of the Tea Party, And I remember watching and documenting what seemed like this fringe element of the Tea Party, which suddenly out of nowhere started really trying to be the leading edge on what it meant to be pro-Israel in Congress. So for that whole period before we had the Trump administration come in, we had those years of the Tea Party where year after year, you would have more and more hardline pro-Greater Israel, pro-settlements, pro-annexing Jerusalem, pro-moving, whatever it is. And those were all led by folks from the evangelical community who in effect were setting out a new dynamic, which said, we are the true standard bearers of the pro-Israel agenda, and you Democrats, you progressives, aren't really pro-Israel enough. And at the end of your question, you asked about how that's affected the evolution of the dynamics. And I mean, you almost have the two parallel dynamics. You have the dynamic within the evangelical community, where this has become in some ways the issue or one of the issues defining as an identity issue. And Sarah's the expert on that. And within right-wing or increasingly just broader Republican politics being one of the definitional issues. But in parallel, on the Democratic side, it has shifted the dynamic as well, where Democrats have been on the back foot now for many years, trying to say, no, we care about Israel, and not defining what it means to care about Israel or be pro-Israel in their own terms, but defining them generally in terms of, no, we're just as pro-Israel as these evangelical Republicans, which is why you saw during the Trump era, one of the only places you could find bipartisanship on the Hill for those 4 years was on legislation and resolutions about Israel. Occasionally you would have one they couldn't get bipartisan support around, say, something that's too openly quashed free speech or something. But time and time again, and we're seeing it again now at the beginning of the Biden era, where it's impossible to get bipartisanship around anything except resolutions about preventing return to an Iran nuclear deal, or Democrats getting on board with an amendment to an early Senate bill insisting that the embassy not be moved back to Tel Aviv, which nobody is talking about doing. But politically, it's still such a potent card to play for Christian evangelicals. So we have to have an amendment saying, don't let the Democrats move the embassy back to Jerusalem, back to Tel Aviv. And Democrats saying, we can't dare let these people be more pro-Israel than we are. So we will join in on telling the administration not to do what it wasn't going to do anyway to prove that we're pro-Israel. And that remains the dynamic today.
Great. Sarah, I want to go back to you. One of the chief reasons that evangelical Christians say they were thrilled with Donald Trump's presidency was his policy on Israel. And yet Trump ran two campaigns that trafficked at times in anti-Semitic language and tropes. He hired white supremacists to work for his administration. He, flirted with this anti-Semitic QAnon conspiracy theory and candidates who trafficked in it, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. So, can you just talk about how these two phenomena are squared? This kind of flirtation with anti-Semitic tropes on the one hand, and yet this pro-Israel policy, and why evangelical Christians seem not to see a dissonance between those two?
Yeah, to me, it's been one of the most confounding things about covering Trump's relationship with evangelicals, because on the one hand, they're claiming to be the most pro-Israel and we love the Jewish people, yet they say nothing about, when he said there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville and that sort of thing. And as you point out, the QAnon conspiracy theory, which, by the way, white evangelicals are, a big chunk of them are supporters or adherents to the QAnon conspiracy theory, right? And so I think something that we saw in Maya's film so vividly is how some evangelicals can look at themselves and say, I'm very pro-Israel, yet say very anti-Semitic things, right? So the scene I'm thinking of in the film is when Pastor William, the patriarch of the church that you reported on, and he was talking to Yael about her visit to Los Angeles for the fundraiser. And he was talking about all the wealthy Jews and the movie moguls and how their hearts were going to be turned to Jesus. But he talked about them in this like very sort of anti-Semitic tropish way about they were wealthy movie moguls and all of that. Like Hollywood controls the world. So I do think that they can inhabit both of these spaces, where I think that they don't acknowledge that kind of anti-Semitism and elevate their own philo-Semitism in place of it. And with regard to Trump and why they can overlook his anti-Semitism because of his Israel policy, I think it's part and parcel of how they see him as this anointed figure that God brought to America at this critical juncture in its history, and that relates to Israel as well. And so in their view, he doesn't have to be perfect. He doesn't even have to be a Christian, because he's carrying out God's purposes. And so I think that they've papered over all of that with all of those pieces of the puzzle.
Noting that this is not an entirely new phenomenon. I mean, that Arthur Balfour, right, the framer of the Balfour Declaration, was himself an anti-Semite. He didn't want Jews immigrating to the UK. If you feel like Jews are creating too much diversity in your own country and subverting the kind of dominant culture, you might find the idea of them going and having their own homogenous society, particularly if you like homogeneity and hierarchy in general, as kind of an appealing idea. Lara, let me go to you. Maya's film documents the warm embrace of evangelical Christians by Israeli right-wing politicians, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, and by the entire settlement movement. In the film, you comment, it is understandable that Israelis would seek allies. It is a question, though, of whom you would decide to ally yourself with and what it says about you. Can you talk about what you mean by this?
Sure. And I also just want to reflect on the link to something that Sarah just said. Part of the question of why, American evangelical Christians who, want to not worry about the apparent anti-Semitism of Mr. Trump, I mean, part of the answer is that Israel gave them cover not to, right? The Prime Minister of Israel, and by looking at polls, a large portion of the people who are citizens of Israel said they don't care about the apparent anti-Semitism around our last president. So why should evangelicals in that sense be more concerned about anti-Semitism than a lot of Jews? But in terms of that quote, what is, I think, striking, and this is something that's been talked about a lot in the past 4 years, is this sort of values gap values chasm that has become apparent between Israel and American Jews. And for a lot of American Jews, most of whom are progressives and Democrats, it is understandable, as I said, why Israelis and why the Israeli government would always want allies. You should take allies where you can, right? You see yourself as under fire. But there is that question of who you ally yourself with. And, for the past, it's not just the past 4 years, but it really came under a spotlight in the past 4 years, the sense that the Israeli government and many Israelis basically are willing to align themselves with the most illiberal forces in the world, if that's what it takes, in order to not have to look at what they're doing or take criticism or be held accountable for their policies in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's really quite striking. It's fine to, you can say there's realpolitik, but, as a Jewish American, the idea of Israel as a light unto the nations and all of that, it's really been challenged by this warm embrace. And it's warm embrace not just of American evangelical Christians, but it's people like Bolsonaro and Duterte and, and Orban. It's a much broader phenomenon. And the sort of bottom line for me goes back to something that Sarah just mentioned as well, which is this idea that, philo-Semitism is now the name of the game. Israel appears to be less interested in fighting actual anti-Semitism and more interested in fueling, stoking philo-Semitism. And philo-Semitism is not the opposite of anti-Semitism. Philo-Semitism is a fetishized love of the Jewish people, history, Israel, which is another face of anti-Semitism. And Israel seems to have sort of gone all in on this. And that's really, the visuals of the past 4 years have just been, every single day have been a piece of that. And by the way, we saw some of that yesterday with Mike Pompeo, the day after he spoke at CPAC, with all the problems with this year's CPAC, including a very problematically shaped stage. The day after he spoke at CPAC, he was feted yesterday for his accomplishments for fighting anti-Semitism by an organization that's supposed to be about combating anti-Semitism. But they're very clear what he's being feted for is moving the embassy and pushing the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? It's not actually fighting anti-Semitism. It's fetishizing love of the Jewish people in Israel.
Maya, there was a great New York Times interview last week with you, and I was struck by one particular comment you made on the question of whether evangelical Christians are motivated truly, as they claim, by love of and support for Israel. Your response was, when someone loves you just for being Jewish, there will always be someone who will hate you just for being Jewish. And regarding support, you said it is not support of Israel, it's support of a right-wing agenda that many people here wouldn't agree with. Can you talk more about this, the question of what it means when evangelical Christians say they, quote unquote, love Jews and, quote unquote, support Israel?
Yes, of course. So, I think when you come to start to explore this story, the first thing that you meet is actually people that constantly say to you that they love you. And after I've been hearing that for time after time on my meetings with the Christian evangelicals, I just started to ask myself, but what it actually means, like how you can love me if you don't know me and you never met me before. And then I started to ask the people that I was meeting, but what do you mean by that? And I have to say that the most honest answer I received from one young evangelical that we met on Christians United for Israel Summit, he said to me, Maya, you need to understand, when they say to you that they love you, they actually mean that they love Jesus. And you're just part of the story. And we cannot make it without you. So you kind of said to me, you shouldn't take it personally, it's not like an actual love to you. And then he said, and you just the key, and what you do with the key when the door is open. And this comment really, I think it explained many things to me from what I was seeing around myself when we were filming. And for the question of support, I think, and that's very much connected from what Lara said and Sarah said as well. I think what happens with them, that they basically own today the meaning of the support of Israel, right? They are now deciding what is considered to be support. But when you're looking into their actions, it's very much a support of a very right-wing approach to this place. And I think the best example that I filmed was, of course, the event of Kufai, the annual summit of Kufai, when I saw 5,000 evangelicals in a huge lobby event sent to the Capitol Hill to lobby against that Trump will cut the aid to the Palestinians. And a month later, it actually happened. And I remember myself standing there and saying to myself, but I know that the security community of Israel is really against that, because the security community of Israel understands what it means to have a humanitarian crisis in our borders. So here we are. Benjamin Netanyahu just finished to say to them that they're our best friends, and they're pushing to this very specific agenda, when I know that it has nothing to do with the reality on the ground, with the security reality on the ground. So I do think, and that's important to remember, these people has their own story, and we are part of this story. And it doesn't mean that they always really supporting us. They basically supporting their own agenda. And if sometimes it goes together with what many people in Israel would consider as a support, but many people would consider as exactly the opposite. So, and I think, when you're looking also on what happens with the Jewish community in the United States, and this much better than I think they basically started to own the word support of Israel. And I think it's extremely problematic. And basically it's actually exactly what happens here with the right wing. The right wing today own the word, the love of Israel, and be and they almost own the flag. And if you're on the left wing, you're most of the time would be colored as a traitor. So I think it's similar processes that happening, and I think that the film also shows how dangerous it can be.
Laura, at one point in Maya's movie, you say the Israeli settler movement in some ways is like the evangelical movement of the Jewish people. You have two ideologically motivated crowds pushing an agenda that is handed to them by God. Can you talk more about this alignment of ideologies and its impact on the ground?
Yeah, this is something I thought about a lot when I was in Jerusalem in the 90s covering the settlements, and then sort of saw the flip side of it in the US. I mean, there is a remarkable symmetry between these two groups of people who both look at the same land and believe that they are on a mission given to them by God. And it's a mission because it's given to them by God where the ends justify the means, including, aligning yourself with whoever you need to align yourself with to achieve your goals. And it goes to, this question of, often, it's asked, well, how can Jews in the West Bank become, the settlers be comfortable aligning themselves with people who see them maybe at the end of their story, the evangelical story, is dying in a pool of fire or something. And the answer, I think, to some extent, is it's just not relevant. If you believe that God has told you this is what's going to happen and this is your role in making it happen, you don't necessarily care um, whether some of it's in contradiction of what the people you're standing with believe, because frankly, you are treating, for settlers in the West Bank, Christian evangelicals are useful idiots, supportive of their mission. I suspect it's the same for Christian evangelicals looking at settlers in the West Bank. There's a certain symmetry there to we are useful, each sees the other as a useful tool in their own messianic view of how things work out. But in both cases, I think it makes it a challenge for non-messianic people, whether you are Christian or Jewish, to fully grasp the seriousness of the agendas that are being promoted here. It goes to something that I said a lot during the Trump era, which is, take these people at their word, they mean it. The settlers in the 90s, when they were faced with Oslo, and I had these conversations with people on the ground, and they were unconvinced, they were utterly unconvinced that Oslo was going to be a problem for them. God will sort this out. We are meant to do what we're going to do, and we're going to keep on, pushing through. And they did. And I think that failing to take them seriously in the 90s is part of the reason that Oslo failed. And I think failing to take evangelical Christians seriously when they started to really push in on this issue politically in the US is one of the reasons why they've been so enormously successful at hijacking the issue. But there's this great symmetry, I think, when you look at these two groups on the ground, which makes them ideal allies for each other and makes them incredibly difficult for non-ideological, non-religiously ideological people to properly understand and properly respect the seriousness of their endeavor.
Maya, following up on Lara's answer, can you talk about how evangelicals view Palestinians and how they respond to Palestinian suffering? And how do evangelicals' approaches towards Palestinians mirror or differ those of settlers themselves? There's a powerful scene in the film where an American evangelical Christian leader hears from a Palestinian Christian priest in Bethlehem about the plight of Palestinian Christians and walks away from the conversation saying there is no such thing as a Palestinian, and accusing the priest of theological anti-Semitism, basically for asserting the existence and legitimacy of Palestinian Christians.
Yeah, well, first, I think it's important to say that the evangelical community, they're not monolith, right? So it's not like the Catholics, they have the Pope, and you can consider what he says as this kind of thing that would, most of the Catholics would agree with on. And the evangelical community is very diverse. So everything that I would say would be, of course, connected to those that I met. And I know that there are Christian evangelicals that are, that understand the problem here on the ground with the Palestinians. There's an organization that called Tell Us that works with these people. So everything that I would say now, of course, connected to the people that I met. I do think that, and the scene that you mentioned where one of the main characters of the film, Pastor Boyd, goes to Bethlehem and meets a Palestinian pastor. And it was an amazing scene to film as well, because basically understood that there's, two brothers sitting one next to each other, but there was a void between them. And I understood that they just cannot agree with each other. And I think it was a great example of politicization of the religion in a certain sense, because Boyd, as he says about himself, has been indoctrinated, and he's actually using this word in the film to have a certain political worldview. And he thinks that the Jews should live, that the land that God promised to Abraham belongs to the Jews. And of course, it makes the Palestinians basically irrelevant for them. So I just saw, and it was almost heartbreaking, because on a personal level, I really like Pastor Boyd, and I think he's a good guy. And I saw at that moment, you could see that what a huge power this indoctrination that he went through is actually, how much power it has. Yes, for the people that I met, most of them would think that the Palestinians just not supposed to be there, I guess, and they mostly looking at the Jews when they go and live in what they would call Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. This is part of the prophecy and what God promised to the Jewish nation, and it really goes down to that, and that's why I have this amazing interview with Pat Robertson, and a part of it that is not in the film, but I will tell you, Pat Robertson told me how he was together with Bibi Netanyahu during the negotiation with Clinton and Arafat. And Pat Robertson tells me how he sat with Bibi and told him, don't give them any land. When you need to own it. So it's a really unbelievable story that an evangelical leader sits with the Prime Minister of Israel during negotiation and says to him what he thinks should happen here on the ground. So yeah, I hope I answered your question in that sense. But I just think that the thing is just, that's the thing. The Palestinians are not part of the story. And I will keep go back to this. There's a story there, and there's a prophecy, and everything goes by this plan. And the Jews has a role, and Palestinians just doesn't.
We should probably say I'll get to you. We should probably just note that while evangelical Christians are not a monolith, settlers are not a monolith either in terms of their motivations. While they are all in violation of international law, there are settlers who move to the West Bank for economic reasons rather than theological reasons. Lara, please go ahead.
It's just worth adding, like I said, I mean, in the 90s, I remember as far back as the early 90s, this issue of the hardline evangelical groups coming to the West Bank and, visiting settlements and helping out in settlements, part of their almost a mission. And the Christians on the ground, Palestinian Christians, just baffled and convinced that if Christian Americans just understood there were Christians in the West Bank and Jerusalem, that their views would be at least more nuanced, and they were wrong. But what's also striking to me is that many of the same policymakers who are so strong on, all the land is Israel's, there are no Palestinian Christians, just ignore them, are also the same ones who hold up the banner of Christians across the Arab world as a wonderful weapon in sort of an Islamophobic campaign. You defend Christians everywhere except the Christians who actually live in the Holy Land, because those Christians are inconvenient to your worldview and therefore have to be written off somehow. It's really, it's tragic, actually. I just wanted to throw that in.
Right. Or if you acknowledge that they face any problems at all, you blame it on Palestinian Muslims, right? Because that's part of the whole framework, right? That it can only be seen through the lens of Muslims being the problem. Sarah, I want to go to you. You've written about something called the prosperity gospel, and I want you to dig into it for us. In Maya's film, there's a scene where Yael Eckstein visits the fundamentalist Baptist church pastored by William and Boyd Bingham, where Boyd, the younger pastor, drives her through his poverty-stricken Appalachian town, yet she then willingly accepts a $25,000 check to the IFCJ when it is evident that the community could use this money far more than her organization, which is also seen in the film giving a $5 million check to the American Friends of the IDF. Later in the film, Boyd in Israel tells Yael that his church has acquired a new tract of land, evidence to him that his church was blessed for blessing Israel. What does this tell us about the influence of the prosperity gospel in Christian Zionism?
So the prosperity gospel is a theology or an ideology within American evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, which says that God wants you to be rich, and that if you sow a seed with your pastor, with another ministry like the IFCJ, God will give you a supernatural return on your investment. Meaning that like you will be blessed in return. Now, typically, independent fundamentalist Baptist churches like the Bingham's Church are not full bore embracers of the prosperity gospel. But for example, the prosperity gospel is very prominent within Christian Zionism because the most prominent figure in Christian Zionism in the United States or the world is John Hagee, who is a purveyor of the prosperity gospel and has profited from it immensely. And so it seemed, and nonetheless, the prosperity gospel, it's not pinned necessarily to a particular denomination, but it's been very influential in cross-pollinating with a lot of American evangelical churches. And so its influence is felt throughout evangelicalism, even if people might adhere to it to varying degrees of intensity. But it struck me in these conversations that Maya showed in her film that there's been sort of some mushing together of the Genesis 12:3, that God will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel, which in my experience in covering Christian Zionism has been portrayed to followers as more like, God will curse America if America doesn't stand behind Israel. And so that's why we have to be very mindful of standing with Israel. But I felt like he had sort of mushed those two things together, and in encouraging his young congregants to save their pennies, and put in those bins that Maya shows in the film. And then that produces this $25,000 check, which was like really eye-popping given the community. And then that he portrays it to Yael as, we were blessed because, we got that tract of land because of, so it's like a kind of a supernatural occurrence, because giving her the money doesn't like financially give you the tract of land, but he made it seem like it was a supernatural thing. And she used the phrase, she said, you sowed a good seed. Like she knows the lingo. She knows the prosperity gospel lingo, obviously, because I think she's probably been to a lot of churches where it's preached. So that was really striking to me. And it actually made me go look at the IFCJ's tax return, because one of the hallmarks of the prosperity gospel is that the leaders profit from it. They tell the followers that they are the ones who are going to get a supernatural return on their investment for sowing the seed. But it's actually the leaders who end up with the fancy mansions and the private jets and the luxury cars. And in the last year that Rabbi Eckstein, Yael's father, was alive, he had like an $800,000 compensation package from IFCJ, and she had about a $500,000 compensation package. So I found that pretty striking, because those are big salaries for a nonprofit.
Absolutely.
I want to add on that, if that's okay, because
please.
It's connected to what Sarah said and about the prosperity question. So I can tell you that we filmed, actually the first filming day that we filmed for this film was in Mar-a-Lago. It was at the annual gala of the IFCJ, and you saw on screen. So in the crowd there were very wealthy Jews and very wealthy Christians, and you could see testimony after testimony on the screens of people that said, I had a small shop in, Iowa, and now I have 20 shops around the United States after I started to donate to the Fellowship of Christians and Jews. So they really link it. And I think that also, because it was, of course, on screen, it was the promotion films of the IFCJ, and I think the fellowship understand that. So it's both sides understanding this game almost, and it was it was fascinating to see. And yes, I can tell you from being with the Binghams, and what Sarah talks about, this interesting combination that they do. I can tell you that, of course, it's that everything is edited, but like that when he says God will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel, and I want to be on the blessing side. So it's all very much connected, and actually it was fascinating for me to listen how Sarah sees and understands the film, and you definitely, Sarah, know the complexity of the conversation that happens there. Thank you for that.
I just wanted to say also that something that's very common in prosperity gospel churches is for the followers to be told to sow their best seed. Yael made reference to that, but also to give their first fruits. So, I've interviewed people who left John Hagee's church, and they told me that there was a lot of pressure to give what they called your first fruits, which means that the first money that comes into you before you pay your rent, before you make your car payment, to sow your seed with the church. That's sort of considered sort of like your best money. And I had that kind of queasy feeling watching those kids put their coins in the bins in your film, because I just felt like, oh my God, these kids, he talked about how, the opioid epidemic has hit this town really hard. And I just, it just broke my heart, because I've reported a lot on the prosperity gospel and the effect that it has on people. The idea, they suffer from the idea that they have to give this first fruit and that they're going to get their supernatural return on their investment. And if they don't, what if you don't have a multiplication of the stores that you had in Iowa? It means that you don't have enough faith. So it's a very harsh ideology, and it's very that it's gotten wound up with this, Israel-Palestine politics is extremely distressing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Peter. I don't want to interrupt. I just want, it's important because, I've been there, and again, it's important to say that this church, so basically the money is collected from all the people in the church, and there's tithes in the church. And yes, and I have to say that this community also helps to the poor people in the community. But it's true, they send part of the money, they send to the fellowship, and of course, as an Israeli there's a big question, just a moral question on looking at that. Even those, even of course not all the 25K are made of this, of the change of these kids, but the idea that such a poor place where the poverty rate of kids is 50%, it's crazy numbers, and sends like the money that they have, even a small part of it, to here. I think it's a huge moral question to ask here in Israel. And I can tell you that when the film has been released here in Israel, that was something that really struck a huge debate on should we take the money or should we not. And I can tell you that Pastor Boyd told me that he started to receive phone calls from Israel that people say to him, thank you for sending the money. So it goes, and yeah, it goes further and further.
It's probably also just worth noting, that this language of first fruits itself, right, comes from the notion of, when Jews had a temple, of bringing a whole series of different sacrifices for different purposes. And so it's a way in which Christians are taking a language that is originally a kind of language that comes out of the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic texts and adapting it for their own purposes. And given that the first fruits were things that were given in Jerusalem themselves, right, that it's another way of reconnecting of that connection to the Holy Land, since this was a kind of a reenactment of a process that actually was a kind of religious ritual taking place in the land of Israel itself. I want to go back to you, Maya. In the Times interview, you commented that with respect to the relationship between settlers and evangelical Christians, quote, the amazing thing in this relationship is each side thinks the other one is stupid. Each side is trying to trick the other. Can you talk to us about what you mean by this and how it plays out in practice in this relationship?
Yeah, from all the interview, I have to say that this specific word, stupid, maybe I would, if I could have a chance to rephrase it, I probably would. I don't think that they think stupid, probably not the best word, but what I meant in that is that I think each side thinks that the other side is deeply mistaken, right? It's important to remember it's a conversation between people of faith. So it's not like, you know, myself, I'm a secular person, I'm talking with them and say, well, okay, this prophecy, it's true, it's not true. I'm not into this game. It's so these two sides of people of faith, and they still can look into each other's eyes, understanding that like from their perspective is deeply mistaken. And there's this wonderful scene that I really love in the film where Sandra Barr is she's a settler woman. She hosts a group of Christian evangelicals at her home, and she holds the Bible, and she says, well, this is my Bible, and you have a little addition here. And you stand in and say, really, a little addition? It's like it's Jesus, it's not little. It's actually pretty big. And in that, so two sides that really, you know, think that the other side is deeply mistaken, and still decide to close their eyes and say, well, we have something to achieve right here and right now. So for the settlers, this is their biggest group that supports them out of Israel. And for the Christian evangelicals, this is the fulfillment of prophecy. You know, everything that happens here on the ground is basically takes us one step forward towards the return of Jesus Christ. And they want to be in this game, not in the game. They want to be part of this process. And so I think it's I guess hypocrisy. That's what amazes you the most when you see these two groups sitting in one room, looking to each other's eyes, and still, you know, and still just ignoring this huge elephant in the room. That's what I meant by this quote.
Right.
Can I just jump in and add this? I feel like there is a theological asymmetry in that relationship, because on the Christian side, they believe that they will eventually be able to convert these Jews, right? They believe that eventually Jews will see the light and accept Jesus as their Messiah. There's no analogous belief on the Jewish side, right? And so I think it gives the theological relationship this asymmetrical component, whereby, you know, the Christians are believing that they're eventually going to bring the Jews into their side, but there's it's not in the reverse.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Maya.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just, Sarah, totally right. It's a very asymmetric relationship. Also, on the numbers level, we need to remember Jews are, I don't know, like how much, if we go to the high number, it's at 20 million. And if we go to the high number of the Christian evangelicals, at 800 million in the world, it's not an equal relationship. And,
right.
You know, Yossi Dagan in the RSC, in the Republican Study Committee, which is one of the biggest conservative caucuses in the Hill, and it was really surreal situation where there were like 300 mostly white men that opened their event with a prayer, then celebrated the ban of the transgenders from the American army, and then Yossi Dagan, the head of Samaria region, stands up with the Bible in his hand and says, "We are friends." And we're working together. And it's just, and when you're looking at that from the side, you say, this is not friendship, and they're not working together. He's so small and they're so big. And you're totally right. These relationships are not equal. And the Jews are not on the winning side for this, that's for sure.
Right. I want to go to Lara, but I just wanted to add, but I also do think it's, while recognizing that asymmetry, it's also important to remember that people who see this relationship through Jewish texts are also likely to be inclined to believe that the great powers come and go, right? That, you know, Greece, Rome, Babylon, Persia, Edom, right? They come and go. The Jews endure, right? And that God uses, right? Just like God, you know, the King Cyrus from Persia allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to go back, that God uses great powers in various ways to fulfill things for Jews. So I think that that's, I think, also part of the story on the Jewish side. Lara, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything you all are saying. I would say, maybe I take a slightly more sort of cynical view on this. I mean, I sort of look in terms of impact. It's very clear that the Israeli right wing, not just the settlers, but the settlers in particular, have seized on evangelicals as a useful source of support. And that's great. They need that because, the Jewish American community cannot be relied on to support Greater Israel and violations of human rights and expansionism and annexation or whatever. I mean, we ask questions, we challenge. I mean, it's a problem. For years, they have seized on the evangelicals as a really excellent opportunity to get support for what they want. And that means closing their eyes to anything else. So it isn't seen, the hypocrisy of aligning themselves with groups that are homophobic or xenophobic or misogynist or, which may be fine. I think that a lot of that is present in the hardline settler groups as well. You see a growing illiberalism that goes beyond just the Palestinian issue. But on the other side, the evangelicals, I mean, the Jewish community on the ground in Judea and Samaria is an instrument of God's will, right? It isn't I mean, if they can convert them, that's fine, but it doesn't really matter. And this goes back, I think, to this whole idea of sort of philo-Semitism. This is, Jews here are an instrument. They are players in a play which is not, they're not the main characters, right? And that seems to suit both sides just fine. I will say, as a Jewish American who's worked on Israel-related issues for years, where every single person that I talk to is scrutinized by the right to see if I have crossed some line by talking to someone who's too pro-Palestinian or, potentially has said something once in their life that could be interpreted as anti-Semitic to prove that I have no credibility. It seems that there is no litmus test at all. You can be in bed, if you're on the Israeli or Jewish right, you can be in bed with anyone if they are pro-Israel. But if you're critical of Israel, you don't have that space.
So I wanted to go to you. We had a question about the end times theology, and what I wanted to ask you was how you think about disentangling that theological, if it's possible, that theological motivation from other potential motivations. Because it does strike me that people who have a right-wing commitment in the United States who are not evangelical Christians, whether they're Catholics or even more secular, still tend to be quite strong supporters of Israel. Whether because, during the Cold War, there was a whole geopolitical rationale, as we've talked about. There's a kind of a clash of civilizations, anti kind of Muslim, kind of, we're in the war on terror together kind of rationale, which has had some potency since 9/11 in particular. So I wonder if you can just talk about if it's possible to disentangle the theological from political motivations and how they may intertwine with one another.
Well, it's hard to disentangle the theological from the political, but I think a lot of people tend to reduce this theological political commitment to, well, the evangelicals can't wait for Armageddon and for all the Jews to perish in the lake of brimstone and for Jesus to vanquish the Antichrist. And they can't wait for that to happen. And that's all they care about. And I don't think that that's actually true for a lot of them, like that they think that's going to happen, right? But they also don't think that they can do anything to make it happen. And I'll get to these people who think that they can in a second. But a lot of them don't necessarily think that anything that they do will speed that up. They believe it's on God's timing, but they do believe that it's their duty to support the settlements because their theology tells them that God gave that land to Israel, including what they call Judea and Samaria. They do believe that they have to try to convert Jews, now, because they do believe that when the end times come, the non-converted Jews are going to be forced to convert anyway, or they're going to perish. So but it's complicated. Like, not everybody sort of sees it the same way. Like, some people will say to you, it's all prophesied in the Bible and it's going to happen. I don't know when, it's all God's timing. But in the meantime, it's my obligation to support Israel. It's my obligation to preach the gospel to the Jews, to bring the good news to the Jews, to bring them salvation. So it's not necessarily that they're, hungering for some kind of war, right? but some tend to be like more pro, they were very pro the Iraq war. They're pro, possibly going to war with Iran and backing out of the Iran deal and all of that. But, just like people on the ground, like the notion that they're salivating for Armageddon is not actually quite right. Like I think for a lot of them, they do believe it's God's timing. Now there is a chunk of evangelicals who are what are called post-millennials. So like unlike Pastor Boyd, who has the whole scenario played out, he's a pre-millennial. Post-millennials believe that they have to prepare God's kingdom on earth before Jesus will come back. So they have to get it ready and then he'll come back. And they're, kind of a growing group here. And they also claim to be pro-Israel. Because obviously that's where Jesus is going to come back, but their language tends to be much more sort of openly anti-Semitic, like saying things like, Jews have a spiritual blindness and that's why we have to bring them to Jesus and so on. So the theology is, more mixed or diverse than it might appear at first blush. I mean, obviously like the Left Behind series and, Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth, which was really popular in the 70s, gave it sort of like this pop culture heft. But I think it's impossible to disentangle the politics and the theology, but the theology, different people take it in different ways. But I think the politics is a lot more uniform than the theology is.
We have a question which mentions Bolsonaro, and I think one of the things that perhaps some Americans were not as aware of, at least non-conservative evangelical Christians, as a bit of a wake-up call, seeing the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, was to realize the power of this kind of politics outside the United States, and particularly in Latin America with evangelical and Pentecostal kind of right-wing politics. And I'm interested if in the course of making the film, you got any sense of how significant conservative evangelical and Pentecostal support is for Israel from outside the United States?
Yes, definitely. And I just want to add on something on what Sarah said, and then I will answer your question. I think another important aspect of that is of recognizing signs. And everything here that happens is a sign. And as John Hagee says in the film, every missile, right? God is watching every missile. And when you see these signs, lift up your hands and rejoice, your redemption draws nigh. So, and I think that when we're thinking, what is the problem, right? When these deeply religious people are involved in a political processes, is exactly that maybe they're not, and I agree with Sarah, it's not that every day they're waking up in the morning and saying, oh, today the Armageddon will happen. It's not that. And most of them also don't think that they can push to that. But when they see all the things that happening here as signs, it means that and the tribulation, right? All the violence that happens here, it's definitely one of the signs. So this combination of them seeing violence as a sign for the return of Jesus and their involvement on the decisions on the political level, that makes me as an Israeli, that scares me, to be honest.
Right,
on a personal level.
But also that they see, some of those signs or some of that violence is part of the Genesis 12:3 thinking, right? That like America has to strike around to protect Israel. Otherwise, God might punish America for not adequately protecting Israel. So that's kind of the thinking on Iran issues, coming from the quarters of John Hagee. So yes, like maybe his followers aren't like thinking Armageddon is going to happen tomorrow, but they are thinking that maybe, bombing Iran might happen tomorrow and it would be a good thing. And that's obviously very dangerous for the world.
Exactly, totally. Yeah, it's less thinking, I think, about the Armageddon. It's actually about what happens here and now, and translating geopolitical events into the prophecy and putting them together. So yeah, for your question about the worldwide movement, I think it's actually a fascinating aspect of this relation that is not in the film, but yes, I definitely explored it. And I think today what happens also, the influence of the Christian evangelical is basically the fastest growing denomination in Christianity. So Brazil, that was a Catholic country, today the Christian evangelicals has a huge power there. Of course, what happens in Africa, also in East Europe, we see these places where the Christian evangelicals plays a much bigger role today. And I think what's interesting, it's even interesting to, if you would go and look on the way that some countries vote in the UN, you will see a certain correlation between where you have countries with a big evangelical community and how they vote, let's say, at the UN. And I actually interviewed and had quite a few meetings with I don't remember their name, but it's an organization that basically works, establish Israeli caucuses in all across the world.
Israel Ally Caucus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In countries where there's sometimes zero Jews. And what the head of this organization explained to me, and it was just really eye-opening. He says to me, Maya, what is the secret sauce? What we do? We establish these Israeli caucuses in countries, in parliaments where there's a big evangelical community. And then we make the question of of Israel not a foreign affairs question, but an internal affairs question of this country. And then he gave me just an example of Philippines, when there's probably zero Jews living there, but there's a huge evangelical community. And then, he just explained it to me. He said, we know that if we push a certain policy through them, then if they just succeed to influence from within. And he also told me, for example, that in Africa today, on the ground, he says to me, evangelical pastors are basically not working, of course, not for a payment, but they acting as an Israeli ambassadors on the ground. And when Bibi Netanyahu had this a few years ago, he suddenly had quite a few visits in Africa, one after another. The Christian evangelical community on the ground was extremely involved in it. So yes, the film really looks into this relationship only on the American angle, but it's a much bigger story. And I think this organization that I mentioned before, on the course of when I worked on the film, they opened like another 20 caucuses in different countries. And yeah, they know what they do.
Laura, I want to ask you about the way that the kind of establishment American Jewish organizations have handled the rise of Christian evangelicals in American politics on the Israel issue. You have some organizations that may have a somewhat similar view on Israel, but are at odds with these groups on some domestic policies. Let's say the Anti-Defamation League on kind of church-state issues. My sense with Aipac is that Aipac, on the one hand, very much welcomes this alliance, and on the other hand, has perhaps been burned a little bit by, for instance, the bad press they got that when John Hagee came to speak there. I was told, one person told me at one point that Aipac does not solicit donations from Christian evangelicals, that they, although there are a lot of Christian evangelicals who go to the Aipac Policy Conference, they actually, they direct them to give money to Kufi. And I'm just wondering what your sense is of the relationship between the kind of establishment pro-Israel organizations and the evangelical right-wing pro-Israel organizations.
I mean, it's a great question. I think the rising, at this point, it's risen power and influence of evangelical organizations when it comes to Israel policy has been something of a challenge for the mainstream major Jewish organizations. Because on the one hand, yes, this is more power, more weight behind an agenda on Israel, which essentially is an agenda of Israel right or wrong, and stand with whatever the Israeli government's doing, and don't criticize settlements, and that's pretty much across the board for the mainstream Jewish organizations. Those are the legacy positions that have existed through the present day. By the same token, it was interesting watching, particularly during the Tea Party era, and into the Trump administration, as groups like AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee were consistently outflanked on the right by evangelicals. One could almost feel a little bit sorry for them. They'd walk themselves into this corner where you can never go too far right on Israel-Palestine, and then suddenly they're finding themselves outflanked by organizations taking positions that are really antithetical to the views of the vast majority of Jewish Americans, and are views that maybe AIPAC has been at great pains for its entire existence to not have to come out openly in support of settlements, even if it does everything de facto to defend and settlements and prevent criticism or consequences for them. It's been almost an awkward kind of, you take off the masks and join us in a true pro-Israel position, or risk being framed as not sufficiently pro-Israel. So that's been a challenge. The other challenge, as you point out, is the hypocrisy challenge. So even for the sort of what my Palestinian friends call progressive except on Palestine, I call them the Israel exception people. So even for the progressives, or the progressive Jewish Americans who are progressive on everything but Israel, who show up at AIPAC, they are still progressive on everything else, right? So the idea that they are finding themselves now in bed with groups that I said are, openly homophobic, transphobic, misogynist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, pick your list of phobics, things. Anyway, it is certainly a. I think it's a challenge. Whether or not they have paid a price, I disagree that they've paid a price. I think, frankly, that there's the ability of AIPAC and American Jewish Committee, or even groups like the ADL, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the groups because we're all really pro-Israel, and find ways to not really deal with the fact that they are giving a kosher stamp to illiberalism. What Maya was talking about. Today, Israel acts as a legitimizer, as a validator for illiberal regimes around the world. Standing with them, standing with Israel at the UN is a sign that you are a friend of the US and Israel, even if your regime is against everything that the US in theory stands for, and democracy and values and all that. Philippines is a great example. Brazil is a great example. It's enormously awkward that that's the role that Israel has taken today. And that's not something that the legacy American Jewish community organizations have dealt with. They've ducked it. And I don't think they've paid a price. I think by and large, the Jewish American community has preferred to not deal with this. And now that the Trump era is over, I think maybe the hope is we just don't have to deal with this. But I think that's going to be more and more challenging. Again, as I said, that one of the very first things that happened in the new Congress was this Jerusalem amendment, so that now the far right, evangelical Christian Zionists can say, see, we forced the Democrats to stand with Jerusalem. On Friday, we had another amendment offered around BDS, which was effectively an amendment by a Republican seeking to condition COVID emergency aid so that's not available to organizations that support BDS, which is just, essentially like saying you have to give up your free speech in order to qualify for emergency aid. It's extraordinary. And
right.
that's now being
you don't want to
used,
vaccinate people who support BDS, right?
But I mean, that's now being used in sort of in a media effort to say, see, the Democrats didn't support this amendment, therefore they're not sufficiently pro-Israel, therefore they're anti-Israel, therefore they're anti-Semitic, right? This is something that I don't think the Jewish community organizations have been willing to deal with. And because being willing to deal with, if you're going to be consistent, you're going to have to deal with some really, being a declared friend of Israel doesn't actually make you good for Israel or good for the Jews, right? And that's problematic when, lining up friends of Israel, which in this case is friends of greater Israel, has been the number one agenda item for much of the Jewish community leadership for decades.
Sarah, we've got a lot of good questions in the Q&A, and one of them has to do with how Muslims and Islam fit into evangelical Christian thinking. And I'm just wondering, I mean, we've talked about this invisibility of Palestinians, right? But we've also been in the United States, particularly since September 11th, in an often highly Islamophobic kind of environment. But how is it that the Christian evangelicals, in your experience, make sense theologically of Muslims and of Islam in their worldview?
In their worldview, Muslims do not worship the same God that Jews and Christians worship. So from a theological standpoint, that's a very common belief. It's also a very common belief that Islam is an inherently violent religion. And it's also a very common belief that Islam isn't even really a religion. It's a political ideology and therefore is not entitled to any protection under the First Amendment's free exercise clause. So all of that is very common thinking among white evangelicals. And there's polling data that I don't have at my fingertips, but that kind of Islamophobic thing is more prevalent among white evangelicals than it is among other religious groups.
Right. And Maya, another kind of theological question a little bit, which is from the Q&A, which is how, in your experience, do the conservative evangelical Christians that you were engaging with think about, if they think about it at all, the Holocaust? Obviously, the Holocaust is a central key factor in many ways for not for the identity of many Jews, but also has occasioned an enormous amount of theological questioning for many Jews and people who do Jewish theology. And I'm wondering, for a group of people who both think in terms of Jews as precious in God's eyes, and yet also think about the idea of a cataclysm in which Jews potentially pay some kind of price for some kind of messianic. I wonder how they then grapple with as singular a phenomenon as the Holocaust.
I think it's, I think the best person to start with is John Hagee. We keep going back to him, but in that sense, I think it's really amazing that the process, let's say, that this person is making on the way that he talks about the Holocaust. So one of the most controversial videos that exist of John Hagee is of him during one of his ceremonies. He basically says that Hitler was a hunter, and connects it to this fate that first God sent Herzl to try to send the Jews to the Holy Land, and once they haven't agreed, he sent Hitler. So basically, what he says is that Hitler was part of God's plan, which something that is really considered as something extremely anti-Semitic to say. That saying also made him very controversial. Of course, today that's something that Benjamin Netanyahu still says to him that Pastor Hagee is the best friend that Israel has in the world. I don't know how it can exist one next to each other. But the same Pastor Hagee, just a few months ago, releases a film about the Holocaust. With enormous budgets and of course unlimited budgets and unlimited ways to distribute it among his believers, and suddenly you see how these people start to explain the Holocaust and basically start to go into the narrative of telling the Holocaust, and this is something that I think this is when I think I don't have the words to say how it makes me angry, because where you see this very strange combination that basically these people today are also the ones that will explain for millions of people across the United States about the Holocaust and the meaning of that. So that's for John Hagee, and I do think it's fair to consider him, to look at him as Sarah said, one of the biggest leaders that this movement has.
Can I just add something there?
Sure.
So just as a window into the radical trajectory of the Republican Party, remember that in 2008, after that video of Hagee came to light, and also video of him saying anti-Catholic things came to light, John McCain, who was running for president, rejected or repudiated Hagee's endorsement. Right.
Hagee's also anti-Catholic too, right? Wasn't that part of the?
Yeah, that was part of it, right? And so that was, not that long ago, 2008, and now Hagee is not just, was not just welcomed at the Trump White House, but just like welcomed in the Republican Party in general. I would also add that the use and misuse of the Holocaust, I mean, for the reasons that, the prophecy reasons that Maya lays out there, that those sort of prophetic misuse of the Holocaust, it goes beyond that, I think, in Republican circles. They often compare abortion to the Holocaust. They often will lament the Holocaust as a time when people's religious freedom was
Right.
in danger.
Right.
And that is why we have to be wary of the left, because the left shows so many similarities with Hitler and with
Or
Nazi
gun rights, right? Gun rights is another way in which it's
gun rights,
Holocaust.
right? Exactly. And so, so like there's multitude of ways in which the Holocaust is misrepresented and misused in conservative circles, and particularly in these religious circles.
Right, right. And I think it's probably worth noting that unfortunately, it's not only Christian evangelicals who have at times said that the Holocaust was some kind of divine punishment. There have been rabbis who've, said similarly odious things.
But I would
Maya,
add that in Trump's GOP, Holocaust denial is also on the rise.
Right. Lovely. Laura, I wanted to go to you and maybe then bring also Maya and Sarah into this. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A about whether there is any evidence that progressive Christians, obviously there are lots of progressive Christians in the United States, but whether there are people who are connected to this conservative white evangelical tradition, but themselves have progressive views when it comes to Israel Palestine. You mentioned Telos, Sojourners. There are other groups that are trying to do this work. Whether you see any evidence that they are having an effect in changing the conversation among white evangelicals, or what that might take for that shift to take place.
So I am not the person to ask that question because I'm not in the conversations within the evangelical community. I will say, as an observer, there is no evidence that I can see that it is having an effect on what is the dominant narrative that was dominant in the Trump administration and which is dominating in the GOP right now. I don't see any changes. I see that continuing to escalate in a more and more what I think of as really radical direction when it comes to Israel and philo-Semitism and all of that. That doesn't mean that there are not changes happening at the generational level. I remember talking to an evangelical leader, this is over a decade ago, who it was around the time, Peter, of your famous article about the change in generational views amongst Jewish youth. And this evangelical leader was basically saying the exact same thing was happening amongst evangelical youth, and they were losing the next generation. The next generation was much more tolerant when it came to homosexuality and women's rights or whatever, and that if they didn't shift, that they were going to lose that generation. And that may still be a phenomenon, that may be true, but in some ways not unlike what's happened with the generational shifts amongst Jewish Americans. It really has yet to trickle up into the actual policies of the organizations and the leadership that's responsible, whether it's because the organizations bring legions of voters or because they have enormous weight in terms of funding elections or whatever those reasons are. We don't see that. And I don't want to say that there's no impact. What is striking to me when I look at this sort of grassroots impact of the more progressive Christian voices in the United States, I see it as part of a general progressive advocacy network. I don't see it as specifically Christian advocacy aimed at changing the views of the evangelical community or other Christians. It's part of a general, we talk a lot about intersectionality now. If you look at sort of the pushback, for example, against efforts to quash free speech critical of Israel, which started under the Obama era, moved through during the Trump era, the big grassroots pushback on that, which eventually pushed Trump to move this, what was then the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, to move it by executive order. That pushback was an absolute grassroots, authentic. It wasn't something that was funded by some single outside party in moving it. And it involved many Christian progressive organizations and groupings, right? Because that aligned with their values, and they became one of this multiplicity of voices out there in the grassroots, but they acted as part of a progressive, not grassroots, working in that environment, not specifically aimed at Christian views.
Sarah, I want to ask a version of that question to you, but I want to specifically focus on race. So, I mean, one of the things that obviously people have talked about a lot in the Trump era is whether the whole category of evangelical, is in some ways, using a religious, misnomer when you're talking about white evangelicals, for folks who in some ways may be motivated as much or more by racial identity than by religious identity. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the way race impacts the way conservative white evangelicals see Israel-Palestine, and also maybe talk a little bit about, you mentioned that among there are plenty of Black evangelicals in the United States who don't have, in general, as kind of anti-Palestinian view, and if you could talk a little bit about that tradition and how it differs.
Wow, that's a huge question. So white evangelicals are a religious and a political category, and they're very motivated and have been motivated since their entry into the national political electoral stage in the late 1970s and early 1980s by racial grievance. I mean, they were motivated a lot by school desegregation. They were motivated a lot by the idea that the government may be implementing liberal policies, what they saw as liberal anti-Christian policies in desegregating public schools and desegregating private schools, and helping to change curricula in the public schools. So you see a lot of the grievances that Trump stoked during his campaigns and presidency about our heritage, our communities, about education, and his attempt to do the 1776 commission and all of that. That's all tapping into the racial anxieties of his white evangelical base. Yes, there are a lot of Black evangelicals, but Black voters in general are obviously, like the data tells us, they vote Democratic. But I've met a lot of Black evangelicals at Christian Zionist events. So the Christian Zionist ideology has some traction in that community. But there are Black Christians who see and find themselves in solidarity with, or see analogies with the Palestinian experience in the West Bank with the Black experience in America. So they find empathy there. But kind of drawing those two questions together with the one that you just asked, Lara, I think that for these more liberal Christian traditions on Israel, whether it's coming from Black Christians who see that solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, or from white evangelicals who take issue with the Christian Zionist ideology, they do not have the cohesive political ideological formation that white evangelical churches and political organizations have, creating this, what Pastor Boyd openly called indoctrination. And they don't have the money. And I think there's also the, for lack of a better word, entertainment factor. I do think that, like, it's not as exciting to hear a story of how we want peace, as opposed to, you have this crucial role to play in these world-defining events that were foreseen by prophets in the Bible and are carrying out God's will. I think all of those things combine to create this hold within white evangelicalism that's hard to break, even when you have fellow evangelicals trying to break it.
Right. Maya, we're just about at the end of time, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to just talk a little bit about how you see this relationship evolving in the future, the relationship that you document so well in your film.
I think I've been asked recently a lot if I think that the film is still relevant after Trump is not a president anymore. But I'm just reminding to everyone that the 2,000-year book is probably here to stay. And the United States will have another elections in 2 years, and then another election in 2 years. But I'm trying to say that these powers are not disappearing. And you know, and as on the settler side, they love to say, it's a Jewish saying, and he will help me to translate it to English, Am hanetzach lo mefached miderech aruka. The eternal nation is not afraid of a long journey. Right. And forgive me for my bad bad translation, but I think there's some, you know, yeah, these people, I really believe that these powers are here to stay, and it's a question, you know, and my goal basically with this film, you know, when I came to this story, I was amazed that no one here is actually, it's not in the conversation, you know, no one asks here, is it good for the Jews? Is it bad for the Jews? Like what happens with these relationships? And I think it's, and of course with Benjamin Netanyahu, it's a done deal. It's pretty clear that he's here to, and he's embraces these relationships. But for the next leaders of Israel, how are they going to treat these relationships? And in many levels, Pastor Hagee has his, like, he's considered to be the leader because he's also accepted by Benjamin Netanyahu, right? They kind of feeding each other. And Benjamin Netanyahu gave almost legitimacy to Pastor Hagee to be such a big, to have such a big place in this conversation. So I do think these powers here to stay. And the question is, what is our secular politics? And we used to look at it as a secular politics, but it's actually not. What is the space that we give to them here? I can tell you that in Israel, for example, the Christian evangelical support is a bipartisan issue, right? It's accepted by both, by the left wing, by the right wing, which is just unbelievable because they're using this word of support, and no one here would say no for the support of Israel. That would immediately put him on a, you know, on being a traitor. So yeah, I think it's here to stand the question: how we will, what is the space that we will give them, and how much power we will give them to influence the reality on the ground.
That's great, Maya. We're out of time. I think the mark of a good Zoom event, I've noticed, is not just how many people are there at the beginning, but how many people are there at the end. And the fact that we still have over 200 people here after an hour and a half, I think is a testament to how rich a discussion all of you have provided for us. On behalf of FMEP, I want to thank Maya, Sarah, and Lara for participating in today's webinar. And thanks to all who joined us for this webinar, and especially those who submitted questions. We will share them all with the panelists. Check back at the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for a recording of this webinar and to sign up for our next webinars and other programs and publications. Thank you all so much.